Hello and welcome to this virtual program with the Paul Sawyer Public Library. My name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian for Paul Sawyer, and I'm so glad to have this wonderful crowd tonight. It's a beautiful evening, but I'm so glad that you are joining us for this event with a wonderful poet, author, and of course our Kentucky Poet Laureate. We had the honor of hosting Crystal Wilkinson earlier in the year, right after her induction as Kentucky's Poet Laureate. She joined us along with some of our other past Kentucky Poet Laureate on a virtual program for Kentucky Writers' Day. But I was very excited when I found out that she would be releasing this collection of poetry, Perfect Black, in August, and I knew that we needed to do a program with her. So we had originally planned to host Crystal at the library in person and do a signing and everything. And of course, we kind of had to pivot and switch back to Zoom. We want to keep everybody safe right now. So she graciously agreed to do this as a virtual program. So I thank you so very much, Crystal, for working with us, being flexible with us on this, and still joining us to share your time and your talents with Frankfurt. We very much appreciate you tonight being here and sharing with us. But again, before I introduce our wonderful guest tonight, I just wanted to remind you to mute your microphones if you haven't already. And if you have questions, do keep those in mind. You can either put them in the chat during Crystal's reading, or you can keep those till the end, and we'll open that up for discussion. So without further ado, thank you for your patience again, but it is my distinct honor actually to introduce you to Wilkinson. She is the Poet Laureate of Kentucky. She's the author of the Birds of Opulence, which was the winner of the Ernest J Award, Blackberries, which was the winner of the Chaffin Award for Appalachian Literature, and Water Street, a finalist for both the UK's Orange Prize for Fiction and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. The winner of a 2020 USA Artist Fellowship, she serves as Associate Professor of English at the University of Kentucky. And she's here tonight to read from and discuss her new collection of poetry, Perfect Black. Crystal, thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you all. I hope everyone can hear me. There's always some problems when you do things virtually. I really wish we could all be gathered together in Frankfurt. That was going to be my favorite part about promoting this book, and my favorite part about being Poet Laureate was getting to go out into the community. But hopefully the surge will start going down, and perhaps we'll be able to do those things together. I do want to say before I get started that I did have a chance to go over to Poor Richard's this morning and sign some books. So if you are in Frankfurt or close to Frankfurt, you can go by and pick up one. I've signed copies of Perfect Black and also copies of my other book. I think as a writer, one of the things I've noticed in this month that Perfect Black has been out is that I'm primarily a fiction writer. So I am learning to adjust to put these poems in my mouth the way that I would sort of readily read a chapter of the Birds of Opulence. So it's been a different experience for me to read them aloud. And you all, the 15 of you all that are here, thank you for coming. We'll get to hear more of the poems. Many of these virtual events have been me in discussion with another writer. And so I'm going to read more of the poems tonight. So I'm going to read for maybe about 20 minutes. And then I want to invite you all for questions. I will discuss as I go along sort of how this book was put together. But I want to read some sort of straight through first, which is a first. I haven't done this before. So I'll start at the beginning. Terrain. The map of me can't be all hills and mountains, even though I've been country all my life. The twang in my voice has moved downhill to the flatland a time or two. My taste buds have exiled themselves from fried green tomatoes and rhubarb for goat milk and pine nuts. Still, I return to old ground time and again, a homing blackbird destined to return. I am plain brown bag, oak and twig, mud pies and gut-wrenching gospel in the throats of old tobacco brown men. When my spine crooks even further toward my mother, I will continue to crave the bulbous tang of wild shallots, the familiar game of oxtails and kraut boiling in a cast iron pot. I toe dive in all the rivers, seeking the whole of me, scout virtual African terrain, sifting through ancestral memories, but still I'm called back home through hymns sung by stout Black women in large hats and flowered dresses. You have to risk the briar bush to reach the sweet dark fruit, and ain't no country woman all church in piney woods. There is pluck and cayenne pepper. There is jute joint gyrations in the young and barren girth of this belly and these supple hips. All roads lead me back across the waters of blood and breast milk, from ocean to river to lake to creek to branch and stream, back to the sweet rain, to the cold water in the glass I drink when I thirst to know where I belong. Many of these poems deal with home, my particular home, which was Indian Creek, Kentucky. And many of them also deal with religion. This is a religious poem, or a poem about religion, when I was baptized. It's called Baptism, Flatwoods, Kentucky, 1972. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Imagine a girl, not yet troubled, dressed in a crisp white dress, black patent leather shoes, and new white tights. Pressed hair smelling of royal crown, bangs curled under, glistening. He was the preacher, the Reverend William H. Mills Jr., long good hair, slicked back, pearl-handled cane, pocket watch chain dangling from a double-breasted suit. We stand in water up to our knees. The congregation reads scripture, eyes peeking up through hymnals and Sunday hats. The Bible is handed to the deacon. I baptize you in the name of the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost. See me submerged in cold creek water that seeps into my nostrils, tastes like danger in my mouth. I fight the hand of the preacher, come up gasping and crying, bless her heart, she's feeling the Spirit, Sister Usher says under a heavenly hat. Everybody claps and commences to sing of being washed in the blood of the Lamb. But I didn't feel devotion, felt wicked with my secrets, wasn't even sure what the Holy Ghost was. See me with my legs closed, my skirt tailed down. See me cover my knees. See me bless my food, and comfort was found in baptismal rewards, a bottle of orange knee-high, a sanctified fried chicken leg, corn pudding, and German chocolate cake. Let the church say amen. My belly full, the most sacred part. Many of these poems are also about my mother. My mother was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic 2 years before I was born. And then she was institutionalized for about 10 years right after I was born. So I was raised by my grandparents. So the next two poems address that. Black Rapunzel. My mother's girlhood drifts beneath the bloody wound of shock treatments. Her memory, a dull knife in some country woman's kitchen. One time when I was real little, all women from down home begin their stories this way. Daddy had this old horse out in the barn, and he told us not to ride it while him and Mama was at the store. They rode that horse all day, and then when it was my turn, that horse fell over dead. They all blamed me, and I was the one who got the beating. My grandfather told me once that Mama was the prettiest one on the place, said she had great long hair as if schizophrenia had erased her beauty. I was 7, a daughter already plagued by the shame of her mother's sickness. In the calyx of my imagination, Mama became our black Rapunzel, letting down her hair, some black and shiny miracle sent to save us all. The next poem is also about my mother. One thing that I always recall, as many of you all probably do too, is that if you grew up in a country kitchen in a rural place, or if you grew up around farmers, when you were a child, when you were little, you always came home to something dead in the kitchen. So one thing I vividly recall was there was always a head in the kitchen. So a cow's head. In this instance, in this poem, it's a hog's head. I would often come home to a hog's head in a galvanized tub. And this poem is about that, and also about my mother. Asking about my mother. In the small kitchen, the hog's head weaves the gamey scent of death throughout the house. My grandmother scrapes black hair from the hog's pink head with the sharp blade of her butcher knife. I ask her about my mother. I always ask her about my mother. I play paper dolls under a formica table with pearls around my neck and pink lipstick from my mother's treasure chest. My grandmother places the head into the tub, and I watch her hands, wait for her to tell me where my mother's gone. My grandmother fills the tub with water. I hate that she always reminds me of all she's done for love. Remember, remember, hair, face, knife. She lifts the heavy tub and situates the hog upon the stove, covering all the burners, and turns on all the eyes. I want to read some Water Witch poems, which I'll save those to the end. So the first section of this book is about girlhood, particularly Black girlhood in Kentucky. The second section is about sort of coming into a political self, my sort of burgeoning self as someone who noticed what was going on outside of me, outside of my little small town, and what was going on in the world. And the third section is more about the woman I am now. So I'll read a few poems from the second section. My father was absent for much of my life, for all of my life, really. And I used to do a lot of imagining about him. I knew some things about him, and I actually met him when I was 13. My father was a city. My father was a place marked with drawn lines, Black people over here, white people over there, small shotgun houses behind fences, mamas on porches with the bright haze of television pouring into the night. Someone always left for dead in his alley. When I looked at my father, I thought of that brother on 3rd Street, the sharp crack of his skull, the 2x4 swinging the last quivers of his life. Sometimes my father was wasteful, but sometimes my father was a celebration, a child's smiling face, gold tooth twinkling, enough kindness to give us rest on nights like this. August 9th, 1974. This is not a political poem. I'm just remembering how I was eating cheese, eggs, and toast when Richard Nixon resigned, how cousins gathered around the TV, cross-legged on the floor, how I wasn't studying no president, how I was studying my cousin's friend Mark, tall Mark with the afro as big as the globe back home on Miss Rigney's desk. This is not a political poem because I was 12 and wearing lip gloss and hot pants, flowers in my hair, so many miles from my grandmother's reach that summer. This is not a political poem, but today I'm thinking about how we got here. I'm thinking about the woman I've become. This is not a political poem, but today I'm thinking about guns and rape culture and men who can't think beyond the power of their pricks. This is not a political poem, but I'm thinking about the swagger in the walk of a 15-year-old boy in Ohio and wondering what kind of man he became. I wonder if he had any children. I wonder if they are alive. And I'll read a few more. This one is called Black Body. My black body is a boulder, a stop sign. Sometimes I think my body is graceful, a song of freedom. Sometimes I think it is something that every eye casts away. I must concentrate if I want to fit into small spaces, slip into the eye of America's needle. Twice last week, I went without eating, filling up on self-loathing and discontent, only to give in to a slice of pound cake and a bowl of ice cream. To stay awake, I drink a glass of tea and watch the flawed reality of television housewives. Before bed, I stretch myself out along the couch and place my feet in my husband's lap. I can't stop thinking about the little black girl in the back of Philando Castile's car. Mommy, please stop screaming so they won't shoot at you, she said. At 4 years old, she saw her mother's unarmed boyfriend shot, bleeding, dead on the front seat. I can keep you safe, she tells her mother. My body embarrasses the famous white woman at the writing conference as if my fat will rub off on her if she gets too close. When I'm sick, I want buttered sweet rice and a tender hand moving in circles on my back. Yesterday, I ate meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans at the Cracker Barrel in Tennessee. The white waitress called me baby doll. Once I remember feeling the quickening of babies in my womb, 4 tiny hands pressing against my navel, 4 tiny feet pressing against my ribs. And I do want to have a conversation, so I'll just read a couple more and then we'll have a conversation and then I'll come back. So as a writer of prose, one of the things that I enjoyed was sort of the blending of forms. This is something that I think the Birds of Opulence, the novel that I wrote before this book, helped me in the writing of this book. When I wrote The Birds of Opulence, it was the first time that I had decided that I wasn't sort of a bifurcated writer, that I wasn't, my poet self wasn't over here and my fiction self wasn't over here and my nonfiction self wasn't over there. It was the first time that I allowed all those forms to sit in the same body. So this is a piece that was originally published in the Kingdom Review. And I think one of the things that I get great joy out of is that no one ever knows what to call it. So it's in my book of poetry and prose. The Kingdom Review, I think, published it as a piece of flash fiction. It's going to be in an anthology of nonfiction coming up, and it has also been called a poem. So I'm going to read it to you, and perhaps we'll talk about what you think that it is. A meditation on grief. Things we carry, things we remember, I remember this place where burdens wash away in the dark and mothers' dresses float like blossoms. A boy drowns, his head turned toward home, body facing the farmer's house where the girl who loves him sleeps. She is the farmer's daughter. They say she is the one who hit his head, the one who hoisted the rock, the one who watched his blood ooze out. This is the way you wash your clothes in the creek. This is the way you catch catfish in deep water. The mothers stand in water to their knees, their dresses wafting out like sheets on a line. On the creek bank, a child runs circles, catching the wind, and the mother's dresses float like blossoms. The mothers sing prayers for the boy's mother who looks out her kitchen window and cries. The circle of mothers in the water whisper a prayer for the girl who tells all who will listen that she loved the boy who died. Her mother stands in the backyard, her hand on the chopping hoe with tears streaming down her face. The fathers brood in the fields, walking slow as lepers, hearts and houses filled with grief. I almost drowned once. My grandmother's dress blossomed around her like a sail. She was my John boat in the creek. My mother stood on the shore, frozen with fear, my father's name mute on her tongue, his kiss spoiled fruit in her young sweet mouth. That dead boy's ghost haunts this place, dark water flowing like a deacon's robe. On nights spoiled with teenage trouble, I went to the creek and waited for the boy, hoping he would listen. Do you dream of the farmer's daughter? I asked. Are you sorry for what you've done? He didn't answer. They say he raped the girl, but I wasn't afraid of him. By then, I had been raped too and was becoming a dangerous woman. I waited for him and held court with the moon. I'm here, I said. Let's get this done. In this place where burdens washed away, I stood, my dress flowering, floating. I was drowning too. My face turned toward home, my black body facing my father's house where my mother cried for me. They say the boy was handsome, but I never saw him in the flesh. At night, the creek did scare me. Its rush like a boy's whispered threat in a girl's ear. But here, the mothers are always standing with water to their knees, their dresses billowing out like sheets on a line, praying because there was always something roaring in those trees, teeth gnashing, fathers killing boys for the sake of their daughters, eyes always watching, eyes always glistening in the dark. And so I think I will stop there, and I would like to invite you all in for a bit of conversation, a few questions, and then maybe before we leave, I will end with one more poem. So you can either put your questions in the chat, or you can open up your microphones and ask questions. One of the things that I didn't say about the book and didn't talk about, I'm happy to answer questions about this too, are the illustrations. My husband, Ron Davis, I don't know if you all can see these, my light is kind of doing strange things. My husband did the illustrations for the book. And I believe that the illustrations serve, it's almost like a, I don't know, like a contrapuntal poem. You can sort of just look at the illustrations and get one message. You can look at how the illustrations are in conversation with each other. And then you can look again at how the illustrations are in conversation with the poems. So it works on a lot of different levels if you look at it that way. So questions, comments, thank you all for your time tonight. And I do have a couple of other poems to read, but I want to see your faces and hear your questions. Does anyone have any? I see Kenny Fresh. Do you have a question?
Yes. Hello, nice to meet you, Ms. Crystal Wilkinson. I've been hearing about you for a while, and this is my first time hearing you read. I'm a poet on the Indiana side of things, and
Oh,
so I wanted to know why the title "Perfect Black"? Why that title?
thank you. Thank you for that question. That's an important one. There is a poem, and I always forget which poem, but there is a poem that those lines come from about being perfect. But one of the things I'm getting at is that, all my life I've been country, and we know that country is sometimes a cuss word. And I think that I was disempowered, unempowered as a child, as a woman, as a girl. Like I never thought that my fat Black self could be perfect, that word would even, there's another notion that we could talk about perfection, and none of us should even strive for perfection, that we don't have to be perfect. But the other side of that is, why can't we be perfect in where we are now? As a young, heavy set Black girl, I didn't see any parts of me as perfection. As a rural Black girl, I didn't see any parts of me as perfection. So it's sort of walking around those ideas. And I'm hoping that these poems as a collective give someone some power, give someone some confidence, make their back straighter. So that's sort of where it comes from. And then there is a poem called Black and Fat and Perfect that appears on page 69. And the illustration that goes with it. My husband might say that's me. I don't want to, we won't, maybe it is.
What's been the reception like for the book? You said it's been out for a month. What's the reception been like?
It's been pretty amazing. Like, I've been surprised. Honestly, I thought that this book would be, my publisher probably won't want me to say this, but I thought this book would be a regional book, and that we would sort of read it in Kentucky, we would read it in Appalachia, and it wouldn't go elsewhere. But, it's been named one of 4 books to read by the New York Times. Poetry Foundation picked it up. I've done all kinds of interviews for it. So it's been received really well, and, received well all over the country. So I've been surprised, but excited about that.
That's awesome.
My fiction's a little jealous, my fiction is like, what about us? But it's been wonderful.
Crystal. Can you talk a little bit about your process for your fiction writing versus your process for your poetry writing, and how the experience of putting together this collection was similar or different to publishing your other books?
Okay. Well, it was very different. It takes me a long time to write a book of fiction too, like Birds of Opulence, which is a small novel. It took about 15 years to write overall. And so in some ways, this book is the same, that these poems, I didn't sit down to write a collection of poetry. This is sort of a collected book. Some of the poems were written long ago. Some of them were written recently. And so in some ways, it was both compiled and written. The way that it came about is that, I love poetry. Love with a capital L. And of course I love fiction too, but I feel like I have a better handle on storytelling, or this is how I felt before. And I would keep my poems sort of tucked away in my pocket, and no one ever saw them. Every once in a while I would send out a few poems and get one published here and there. Then I'd tuck the rest of them away. And so a friend of mine who's a poet, Rebecca Gale Howe, said that, I'm working on a project. I'd like to see some of your poems. I was really busy. I just sent her like a whole file, like the file that I keep for myself. She's a friend, so I just sent her the whole thing. And she said, well, you have a collection on your hands. And I said, no, I don't. and so once she said that, I started looking at them. And one of the things that I did was sort of lay the poems out like lily pads all over the room, and started to see connections that I hadn't realized before. Thematic connections. I think that sometimes the things that haunt a writer haunt a writer for the rest of their lives, for their whole writing lives, and they find ways to sort of walk around it. I always thought that, for example, Toni Morrison seemed to be haunted by relationships between women and girls, and the legacy of slavery, both for white people and for Black people, what the legacy of slavery has brought to us. So when I laid them out, I saw my own haunts in ways that I hadn't seen them before. I saw, a complete narrative arc from childhood to womanhood. I saw themes of sexual abuse. I saw themes of religion. I saw themes of the body, both the Black body and the fat body. I saw themes of rural girlhood. And of course, these things are all things that I've experienced. I also thought that, as I do in fiction, that I had done it in my poetry, which is to plant a thread of truth. In fiction, I sort of love sort of having this thread of truth that's floating underneath all, and, piling the fiction on. So sometimes the writer, mostly I'm an open book and I tell readers anyway, but mostly only me, the writer, will know that this is my truth. And I can sort of say, yeah, buried underneath there is my own truth. And my readers don't even know that. So I can sort of say that in private. But in this book, when I laid those out like lily pads and started putting the book together, I was like, whoa, this is really close to the bone, closer than I've ever written in fiction. So close to myself. Even when the poem is being narrated by a speaker of the poem, that speaker of the poem is maybe just right here, not too far away from me. So the next step was to think about, are they too close? Is this a sort of am I sort of vomiting all of these horrible things that happened to me in my life? And so in the end, what I tried to do and hope that I've accomplished is to have an extension away from myself. Like, these poems are written about me and my experiences. And I'm hoping that by reading them, a reader will either see themselves and identify these tropes and characteristics in their own lives, or they will learn something about someone who's totally different than they are. Did that help, Diane?
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I know some of y'all have some questions or comments, so don't be bashful. Our folks are usually not this quiet over here.
I got another question for you.
Thank you.
I'm not shy at all. So what is some advice that you would give to like an up and coming writer?
Poet or fiction writer, or writer, period?
Let's do poet.
Okay. I think to read wildly and to take risks would be my two things. Read everything you can get your hands on and write. Ernest Gaines was one of my mentors, not so much like in person, but on the page. I did have a chance to meet him, and he was often quoted for this, and I saw him do it at least once, and someone would ask him that question, and he would lean forward, and everybody would have their pens like, oh gosh, he's about to say something. I know he said, I've got 6 things. And so they would lean forward and they'd have their pens ready, like, okay, this is the magic. And he would say, read, 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 write, write, write. And those were his 6, those were his 6 things. And so in some ways I agree with that. Like, I think that's where the magic lies, in practicing your craft, and practicing and taking risk, as many risks as you can, and reading wildly, reading things you love, reading things that you think you won't like, reading things that you hate, reading things from other cultures and experiences that are different than yours.
Okay, as the librarian in the room, I'm going to put you on the spot right now. What are you reading right now, Crystal?
Oh, I have, some of the books are behind me, so it's sort of a library, but I haven't read them all. So I'm reading Liberty by Caitlin Greenidge now. That's behind me. And I'm also reading a couple of brand new books that I'm enjoying that I'm going to give blurbs for. Shout out to Destiny Birdsong, who's has written a wonderful novel that is about to be out in the world, that's going to take the world by storm. That's about other things, but also about albinism. Being out, there's albino characters in it, and it's quite wonderful. And this one, The Final Revival of Opal and Neve, is another book by Donnie Watson. It's another book that I'm reading. And I love Deisha Filial's Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
Thanks, Crystal.
And I could go on and on. Books.
So we have people writing down those titles. They'll come in and ask us for them tomorrow. So we better be on our toes. We got a question from Tamara and from Amelia. Whichever one of you would like to go first, you just go ahead. Amelia, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, Crystal. It's very nice to meet you. I am a memoirist myself, and to see someone write memoir in verse, that's really impressive and amazing. And I have a question. I find finding the courage to tell your truths as a woman, giving yourself permission to tell the truths that are very intimate and true to yourself. How do you pull that courage, and what do you say to yourself to be able to put this out there in the world?
One thing is that I separate it, right? And part of this is probably my sort of self-deprecating way, but I never think, even if I have a contract, I don't think ahead on to publishing that. So I don't really worry about what people will think. That happens after, and I'm always surprised every time. Like, oh my God, somebody's about to read this. But when I'm writing, my goal is always to go to the white hot center of it without flinching. And I sort of circle back and say, have I done that? No, I'm still flinching. And then when I get to that point where I'm not flinching, then I'm like, oh, girlfriend, you've told too much. Like, is this what I want? And then I come to some kind of something in between, but closer to the part that scares me. I do it every time, and I don't really think, like I said, until the book's out in the world, like this book, what happened that first week that it was out and people were talking about buying it. Like, I went online, I was on Facebook, I think, and relatives were saying that they were going to go get it. And so I was like, oh gosh, they're about to, breed all the stuff that happened. And of course they did, but it takes me a while to sort of get over that. And that's been the way with all of my books, with the fiction and the nonfiction. I have a a culinary memoir coming out next year. And I feel sort of the same way about that, although, you know, food, there's nothing sort of tantalizing about food, but there are some stories in that book that my family may or may not like. So, but I think you just have to do it. You have to, I mean, I think that's part of it, is to find an artful way, because I think the art part is as important as the telling. To find a way to turn your experience into art. Because if you are just sort of vomiting your experience, then I'm not sure that's often a problem too. That's why I have to, like, I'll do that and I do the flinching, then I have to find some artful place in between to tell the story. Does that make sense, Amelia?
Yes, thank you so much. And it's very courageous of you to write all the stuff that you've put into Perfect Black. And I'm impressed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. Tamara, did you have a question or a comment?
I did. And actually, Crystal, you started talking about it. I was curious about from the time you started writing, at what point did you begin to feel comfortable including your family and friends and sharing your truths and secrets? When did that sort of gel for you? And do you ever have anyone come up and recognize themselves and complain or brag about it?
Well, I found that, I mean, I've been doing it always, right? But it's that sort of thing of a thread of truth in my fiction. You know, I had a cousin who said one time, "You do the writing, you should write a story." We have well, I shouldn't be telling this story, it's recorded, but my family will watch it and go, aha. But she said, "You're the writer, you should write a story about this particular person in her family." You know, sort of, she wanted me to write sort of a revenge story. So I sort of wrote the revenge story, and then I said, well, I shouldn't do that. So I turned it into more fiction, and I added more fiction on. And so this was in my first book, and the person that I wrote the story about was like in the back of the room at the first book signing, and they were coming down the aisle toward me, and I was just going, my eyes got bigger and bigger. I was leaning up against the wall, and she said, "I love this book, but this woman here in this story, she's a hot mess." And she went on and on and on and didn't recognize herself. So I think that was the first time where I was kind of like, okay, this idea of having a thin thread of truth in your fiction is going to work. It works. I can do it. And then I think it's only been recent that I have been able to do that with nonfiction. For example, I had put little bits of things, the same kinds of things, little bits and pieces about my mother in poems and stories in the novel, but writing about her and her mental illness, her schizophrenia, like directly head on, was a completely new experience. The same thing with the sexual trauma I experienced as a child, as a young girl. When I wrote Dig, If You Will, the Picture, which appears in Perfect Black, and I had been commissioned by the Oxford American to write an essay about Prince, because anybody who knows me knows that I'm like, I should have been named the head of his fan club, but no one ever reached out to me, but I should have been. So from the time that I was a young girl, about 13, maybe even 12, I shouldn't have been listening to him at 12, but I think I was. But when Prince died, I got gifts. People dropped off purple cups. I got, you know, you can't really see them, but behind me, I probably have this many books about Prince, like big picture books that people gave me. I got commemorative, I got cards, letters, all kinds of stuff. So I decided I was going to write an essay where I just sort of made fun of myself as being the fan. I mean, I cried when he died. Somebody came into our bookstore, and I mean, I just collapsed and said, you know, did you all hear Prince died? And Ron was kind of going, don't don't tell her. And I just collapsed and cried. And when I was trying to write that essay, was when I realized that when I started listening to Prince was around the same time that I first got sexually abused, and the two crossed over. So that was the first time I wrote about that in that essay. And I sent the essay in, the editors loved it, but then the day it was published, I was going, oh my gosh, I've let this secret out. It's out there in the world. Somebody's going to read it, and it's not cloaked within a character. This is an essay. This was a lyric essay, and I wrote this about me and my experience. But what happened was I started getting emails and back messages on social media, not so much about Prince, but that people could relate to that other thread of it. And that sort of opened it all up for me at that point. I think that's probably why some of these poems, even though they were written long ago, I had never let anyone see them.
Okay. It looks like we have another question from Anna Main in the chat. She says, have any of your later works been influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement? And are there things from your earlier works that you feel are also connected to that movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think two of the poems that I read, you know, the one about Richard Nixon's resignation, I think that was my first sort of political awareness as a young girl about the world and what was going on in the world. Several of these poems are about one movement or another. You know, what's interesting is that how that poem about 1974 and some of these poems that were written earlier, and then you fast forward to Philando Castile's shooting death, and there we are again, writing about the same things decades and decades later. So certainly the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, civil rights movement, they're all in here because it's sort of a circle. We keep learning that we can't seem to get the lesson right. We keep coming back to it. It's been going on for decades upon decades. And I mean, you look at the work of Sonia Sanchez or Audre Lorde, or, you know, some of our great Black writers, women writers, particularly Ntozake Shange, Bell Hooks, who were writing about these things decades ago. And then you fast forward to other books that have been written. We're still there. Some things have changed, but we're still writing about the same things because the same things are still going on in the world. So a long-winded answer to say, yes, definitely.
Anyone else have a question or a comment for Crystal?
Diane, maybe you can help me with this question. Diane leads the Kentucky book group at the library, and we recently read Water Street. And we actually, as a group, had a question for you because we could see connections between all of the characters except one who just seemed to like show up towards the end.
Angie.
And I couldn't remember the name, and we were wondering where that character came from.
Part of what I was trying to do was move off of Water Street to again show sort of what I'm talking about tonight, that things are a continuum and that this community is isolated, but they're also connected. There is a connection to her earlier in the book. She's just mentioned by name as a cousin, but people often miss that. But she's mentioned in another story, just very briefly as a cousin. I want to say shout out to Karen, who I haven't seen for a while, so it's good to see you.
All right. Did we miss anybody's hand or question or comment? I don't want to miss out on anybody. If you have something, don't be bashful. Well, I will ask something really quick, and you may not be able to tell us much about this, but you said Culinary Memoir coming out next year. That piqued my interest. Can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, it covers several generations of my family. So starting with sort of me and my daughters and going all the way back to my furthest ancestor, who was Aggie of color, who was an enslaved woman, an enslaved child in Virginia. And she was born in 1795 in Virginia and was brought to Kentucky, and is sort of the beginning of my ancestral line. And so it covers sort of foodways and cooking, and the importance of food and preparation of food from that furthest generation all the way back to us. And you can, in Perfect Black, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost is sort of the piece that started that. And it's in here as sort of a lyric essay, long prose poem. And that's what the new book will be called. It'll be out in 2023. And it's called Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost. So it'll be a collection of lyric essays about food, and my lineage, and it will include some recipes.
Thank you for sharing with us about that. I think that sounds fantastic. I know I'll be looking forward to that as well. Did anybody else have a question before we ask Crystal to read a little bit more to see us out tonight?
Who's your favorite poet? Living or deceased?
Okay, so I'm gonna give you two. So my favorite friend poet is Nikki Finney. Yeah, she's my favorite. And then one of my favorites, this is not, you can't ask me for a list of books or a list of writer. And then one of my favorite poets is Naomi Shihab Nye. And then there's lots of others in between around those, including Audre Lorde and Ntozake and Gail Jones. Gail Jones is a Kentucky writer and often thought of only as a fiction writer, but I love her poetry. If you haven't read Gail Jones's poetry, you should look it up. I suggest starting with The Hermit Woman if you can find it. So again, thank you all. And I am going to, how much time do I have, Diane?
You have as much time as you would like, Chris.
No, we don't want to hold people. I've mentioned food, so people are hungry. I'm going to read just two poems. so funny. I don't even know where I am in this book yet. People would say things about Birds of Opulence and I'd be like, there it is. So I want to, there's a connection, of course. I write a lot about family, and there's of course, a connection between my grandparents and my current family. So I wanted to read, I'll end with 2 poems. And there's a series of poems in the book called The Water Witch. They're the Water Witch poems, and they are written in the voice of my grandfather. It's really the only time that I step outside of the speaker of the poems that are very close to me. So they're written from his voice. And this one is called The Water Witch on Reading. And I'm not an actor, but I kind of have to step into his voice a little bit when I read this poem. Oh, I cipher pretty good, and can't no white man cheat me on my crops or on my change at the feed store. I'm known around these parts for being able to remove a wart with a bean. I'm the only one they come to when they want their well witched, and now everybody asks me how many snows we're gonna have come winter, or when they need to pull a baby from a mama's tit. Man from way off stopped here once for me to teach him how to make sorghum. Been learning all my life. I can read a map, can read a man's eyes and see if he's truthful. I can level a girder by sight. I can read the tremble in a cow's gut, a man's footprints in the mud. I can read a man's heart to see if he's right with the Lord, though it ain't my place to say. I can read time by my own shadow. I can read the corners of Christine's mouth and tell if she's mad at me. Only thing I can't read is words. So my grandfather had basically a 3rd grade education, and he could not write or read, but he was an amazing mathematician. Me and him always got in trouble because he did my homework for me. I would read the problem out loud, and he would tell me the answer, and I'd go to the school the next day with the answer, and they'd say, well, how'd you get it? And I'd say, oh, no, my granddaddy told me this was the right answer. So, and I wrote that poem, not for that, just that little antidote, but because I think, even though I'm a professor and I make my living as an academic, I think that we sometimes don't look everywhere for wisdom, particularly in our elders. And wisdom is everywhere and comes in various ways, comes to us in various ways. So in our elders, in our disabled people. And I mean, if you've never done it, you should stop sometime and talk to someone who's homeless. It is amazing. First of all, you find out something about them, but often there is a wisdom that comes from the experiences that they've had that's unlike anything you've ever experienced. But when we're, feeling ourselves, I'm Professor Wilkinson, then you don't see those people and you don't take that in. So I'll close with a love poem, and you will see the loop that I always admired the love between my grandparents, and I've always been sad about the fact that my husband Ron never got a chance to meet my grandparents. So this is about that, and it's called Witness for Ron Davis, who's my husband and who also illustrated the book. And if you see if I can do it, I don't know if you can see that. I'm awful at this kind of thing, but there's an illustration of a couple, and I don't know if he intended it to be, but I said, when I saw it, I said, oh, that's us. He went, I don't think it's really supposed to be us, but it is to me. Witness. I'm convinced that if you could have seen my grandmother standing in the doorway waiting for him to come home from the fields, if you'd smelled that spectacular evening thick with sweat and felt the pulsing of the stars, if you'd borne witness to the animals' moans echoing in the holler that night, If you just could have seen the hair rise up on Granddaddy's arm like that, like offerings to God when his elbow touched hers. If you could have seen her longing dissipate just a little as he came to the door, smelling like a day's work. You should have seen them close enough to breathe the same air while not even touching. He smiled at her without smiling. If you could have seen them watching me watch them, then you'd know how much I love you. If you could have heard her say, "You want some supper? We got pie." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I truly appreciate you taking the time to share with us tonight. And it was wonderful. And I want to congratulate you on the collection. I do hope that everybody will be able to get their hands on a copy. We do have it at the Paul Sawyer Library if you'd like to come check out a copy. We also have all of Crystal's other books, which I would highly recommend. But also do stop by Poor Richard's bookstore down on Broadway here in Frankfort. Like Crystal said, we've partnered with Liz Taylor at Poor Richard's many times before. They're our wonderful independent bookseller here in Frankfort. And when we do author events, a lot of times they will come over and be our bookseller. And that was the plan for tonight when we were going to be doing an in-person event. But Crystal was gracious enough to come over and sign some books at the bookstore. So do go over there if you would like a signed copy. You still have your chance to get a signed copy. I know that's always very special to me. So do check that out. But I encourage you to read this collection and also check out some of Crystal's fiction. You will not be disappointed. But thank you so much again, Crystal, for being here. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. I do hope that we'll all be back together in person sooner rather than later. But everyone, do please stay safe. And we will see you on more virtual programming in the meantime. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Oh.